Agri SA, saying it has requested an urgent meeting with Eskom CEO Ruyter to discuss the outlook for load shedding in the country. This is ahead of the summer crop planting season. The organization says it fears that if the current state of energy supply in the country continues, it will have an impact on the local food production and also jeopardize export agreements. Let's get more now, and we speak to the Executive Director at Agri SA, Christo van der Rheede. Christo, good morning to you, and thank you very much for availing yourself for this important discussion. I mentioned earlier jokingly that you in a car, and I wonder whether you headed to Mr. Ruyter. But importantly here, food security is of utmost urgency. Is it affected in any way?
Currently, our farmers are facing quite an obstacle because, remember, many of them are reliant on irrigation. Many of them also need electricity for the processing of agricultural products such as meat and so forth. And then the other important thing is they need your cold storage facilities to keep your products fresh until it reaches the shelves of shops and so forth. So yes, it's quite a big challenge for the agriculture sector.
And so when you say you want this urgent meeting with Mr. Ruyter, key discussion points there, what needs to be done immediately in order to get farmers settled?
I think the important thing is that just before they introduced the lockdowns, during the pandemic, agriculture was declared an essential service. And we would like to see that agriculture as a sector is prioritized. And I'm not saying that we should now be prioritized over the other economic sectors. But food is the most critical need for all of our people. And we need to declare the agriculture sector as an essential service again, so that perhaps we look at ways and means to ensure that the burden of load shedding is lessened to a certain extent, especially when it comes to the agriculture sector.
What worries you most about the consequences of load shedding if it continues the way that it has wreaked havoc in the recent past, Christo? And I ask you this because there doesn't seem to be any immediate solution to the power outages. If anything, they are likely to continue. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with the chairman of the board at Eskom, and he intimated that the engineers have said to him that it's likely going to take us 2 years for us to get some stability within the power utility.
Remember, there's a number of farmers that can afford their own solar systems, their own generators, but those things cost a lot of money. The majority of farmers do not have the luxury of money to spend on those type of additional generation capacity to continue with their operations. So in the absence of financial assistance, farmers will do two things. One, they will cut down on their food production outputs because they just don't have the money to spend on inputs. Remember, it's not just electricity shortage that they experience. We've seen a massive spike in the price of fertilizer, in the price of diesel. Also, we've seen interest rates raised by a number of basis points. So all of these things add to the cost of production. And farmers then have two options. One, to let workers go, or to cut down on production, which will have an impact on food supplies. And if there's a shortage of food supplies, it pushes up the price of food. And who suffers at the end of the day? The consumers out there.
The other element we haven't explored but mentioned in the introduction is the element of the export crops that are likely to be affected by this. But before we get there, how ruinous has this severe stage of load shedding been on farmers, particularly I think of perishable foods or those that need to be frozen?
Look, at this point in time, obviously, most of the products are, especially your perishable products such as citrus and so forth, it's kept on farms in cold storage facilities. And farmers, that are big exporters, they, as I've said earlier, they do have some extra money to buy diesel generators and so forth. And then it is transported by trucks to the harbors. I'm not sure what is happening at the harbors. Perhaps they also have their own generators to keep those facilities going. And then from there onwards it goes onto the boats. But I've spoken to some farmers, and they've mentioned some losses here and there, but it's not too big at this stage, because luckily for us, the citrus season is almost over. But our biggest challenge lies ahead of us, and that is our deciduous fruit season and your summer crops that requires a lot of cold storage facilities. And if those cold storage facilities are not there, or it's not functioning properly, then those farmers face financial ruin.
Let's then conclude the discussion with the export crops. These are food items that we take from our country to overseas markets. How is that going to be affected by load shedding?
I think there's a very good cooperation between the agriculture sector. The Ministry of Agriculture, Mr. Tokotodiza, is really of great help, and the DG, Mr. Ramasori. And then we work very closely with Transnet, Ms. Portia Derby, and I think through institutions such as AgriSA, which is primarily responsible for the agribusinesses, and Agri SA, we work hand in glove to ensure that with our commodity organizations, that our export crops are not damaged in any way. But we hope and pray that we will find a solution for this challenge very soon, and this is where I think government together with Eskom really have to put the politics aside and focus on what is in the best interest of the country.
Well, you've triggered me there. I was about to let you go. When you say put politics aside, we know that citrus is one of our major exports. How has that been affected, if at all, at this time, and what are these politics that you're talking about?
I think, and I must perhaps distinguish between local politics and international politics. So, as you can recall, the EU has suddenly came up with a set of regulations that citrus must be subjected to a longer period of cold treatment, and we took that up via our minister with the EU, and we could then manage to put that aside. But remember, that threat is not yet dealt with sufficiently, and we need to deal with that, but that's a government-to-government thing. But in South Africa, I think the important thing is that the government must really support our export industries, because it's through exports that you grow your economy, because that's new money that flows into the country. You earn a lot of foreign exchange, and through that you can bring about more job creation, you can drive big transformation programs, because in agriculture, unfortunately, it is not just land that is going to drive transformation. You can give land away as much as you can, but if you don't have money, and by money I mean money for production loans on an annual basis, money for infrastructure, and money for other development on farms, then your transformation efforts will go nowhere. And that's why we need to grow the economy so that we build a more inclusive agriculture sector.
Christo van der Rheede, thank you so much for the explanation about how the current bout of load shedding, and if allowed to continue endlessly, might affect food production in the country.